First of all, let me tell you a bit about what I do here. I've been here for, this is my second year, just started my second year. And for those who don't know what the Arts Institute is all about, in this university, as you know, the arts in their departments, you'll find them more or less in 3 colleges. So if you think about art, Department of Art, Department of Dance, Department of Theatre and Drama, those are in education. Then you have art history and creative writing and com-arts, communicative arts, you'll find them in letters and science. And then in SOHI, which is the School of Human Ecology, you'll find design there. But also within design, you find textiles and other stuff. So, I mean, what happened historically in this university is that there was what they call a kind of a group of people. The arts came together, and they created a consortium of the arts, something like 20 years ago. And that has evolved very slowly into, first it became a center for the arts, and then it became an institute. And the governance, I don't want to sort of bother you with that, has changed now into a division. And don't ask me what a division is, because there are various divisions in the university. They're slightly different from each other, but what they do in common is that they report to the office of the provost. So as I also sit, although they don't call me a dean, I also sit, actually, I'm kind of that kind of rank, in Dean's Council. And this is important for the arts, because that means that the arts have representation both through the 3 deans of college, where you find the departments, but also through the Arts Institute, as we sit on the Dean's Council. And that means that, we have, the university very much prioritizes the arts in a very, very strong way. One of the things we should probably know about us is that we also do a lot of work which is facing towards the community. For example, we do the film festival, and those who are new to the university, I'll recommend that they look forward to the film festival, because it's one of those, it's a whole week bonanza of films. It's fascinating stuff. And there are people, actually, I mean, last year was my first experience of it. There are people from around and also beyond Madison, probably even Wisconsin, who actually are great fans, and they come here just for the film festival. We also do an early music festival. When I say we, it doesn't mean that we do it as such, but we work with colleagues. For example, the film festival work very much with communication arts. The early music festival work with a group who was actually based within Madison, but also in part with the music school. So there is a lot of collaboration going on. We also work with our colleagues in order to kind of offer a kind of unified view of the arts. So if someone wants to say, okay, what do they do in the arts in the University of Wisconsin-Madison? There's a website called Arts on Campus, and they go there, and then suddenly they find a portal towards which they can go to any department they want to. And don't forget also that we have the Chazen. So there are various centers, but also various departments, and also various programs. The other thing we do, which we're very proud of, is the studio, which some of you may be members of studio, which is actually a first-year freshman. It actually happens in Celery Hall, where there are a group of students, mostly very much kind of a diverse community, and they're not specialists in art. Most of them are not, but I mean, they use the arts to engage with each other. So there's also First Wave, there's also multicultural groups. So I mean, basically, we very much insist on kind of using the arts or engaging with the arts, or encouraging students to engage through the arts as a community, by which then we can kind of understand each other, then by which we can do all sorts of things. Having said that, and this is what leads me to this, is that I personally don't really see the arts as instrumental, but more or less I want to kind of keep insisting that the arts are part of us, they are intrinsic to us. The word in philosophy is that art has its own immanence, art has its own specificity. The arts in their own different kind of ways and different specialisms have their own character. And as human beings, the arts are unique to us. We always talk about human beings as being rational animals, but we never talk about, sometimes we do, but we don't talk much about, although there are philosophers who talk about arts, the homo aestheticus, the man, or rather the human being, who also has a sense of aesthetics. And, someone once, Karl Marx once said, if you look at, how a spider does her, whatever, and how a bird builds their nest, they have always done that throughout history in the same way. Whereas human beings, they build architecture in totally different ways. They change their tastes. They develop their own ideas, and they develop their own arts. So I mean, the arts are a mark of us being human, and they are a mark of us being different and special as a species. So I mean, this is something which we need to kind of think about. So they're not just means to an end, but actually they are us. They bring us to understand why we are human beings. What, if you remember, with person of faith, why we're here. If you don't believe in anything, why we're still here and why we engage with each other. So I mean, this is a very important point in here, because what I'm looking at is the relationship between arts and education. But I mean, in my own teaching, in my own career, I have always put that at the center of practice. And one of the best ways, I mean, okay, I know this is a nice place to teach in, and I know it's a nice place to give a lecture, but I mean, I enjoy it more in teaching in a studio, for example, even when I'm doing history. And I used to teach philosophy, for example, when I was a teacher's college at Columbia, we used to have studios, which were all very kind of, studios, messy. And I used to bring in people to come and do philosophy of art in education, and non-art specialists used to love it because they've never been in a studio. So I mean, there is that kind of element of, and I used to ask them to do visual work, to engage with stuff. So we engage with concepts through the engagement of not just visualization of concepts, but also just making things. And what does making thing is. I had a colleague of mine who used to teach methodology, and the methodological argument would become a three-dimensional model of some sort. And I remember once there was a colleague, actually a student, who decided to start sort of putting ribbons and tapes all over the place. And those were the kind of lines of inquiry. And then where these lines of inquiry physically met, that would be that you could hang something on there as a concept. And that's where the concept happens. So the whole question of how do you engage pedagogically, if you like, in terms of learning, or in this case, unlearning, it's not through the arts, but actually by making, by being an artist, by, engaging with material, by just being there at the center of it, phenomenologically, if you like. And one of the major artists who showed us this was Joseph Beuys. And so here I'm using one of his works in order to state two things from the start. Here I want to level a critique, if you like, which I want to start. The first one is that I'm very worried that how we teach art, how we also educate artists, is becoming pretty much domesticated. It's starting to fit in a certain kind of sense of expectations, which are either political or economic or social or whatever. And that means that they are limited and they become kind of, they are serving an aim which is other than art itself. The second issue is that this is often done by, and I don't know whether there are any education students here, through what they call the constructivist constructivist argument of education, which basically means that this is good for us, so we do certain things in order to construct realities. Now, in and of itself, that's considered to be historically a very radical and progressive concept. But what happened to that is that it became another form of instrumentalization. I don't know what you know about Ivan Illich, but he is the guy who wrote Deschooling Society. If you like, learning becomes schooled, and that means becomes restricted to a certain set of rules, which somehow we all agree that that's how it should be, when actually we know, especially having been also a teacher myself, we know that how many kids end up outside the school system because either they don't pass exams or whatever, but actually we know that they are very talented, some of them actually are very artistic, some of them have got new ways of looking at the world and all that kind of thing. So even strictly speaking in economic terms, we're wasting a lot of people because actually that talent could be used, but partly because even with all the attempts we do to open schooling, it's still restricted to certain things. Ultimately, it's this whole instrumentalization of art which worries me, and this is where I think we need to kind of keep that in mind. So I mean, with those couple of things in mind, I want to move on. And here what we have is I have a couple of things which probably sum up what I've been writing about. Recently, I've been writing a lot about two questions. I mean, I wrote a book called Art's Way Out, Exit Pedagogy in the Cultural Condition, and it's very much based, again, in examples of art, visual art, literature, drama, and all sorts of things. But the argument is there, is that one argument is that art is a form of unlearning, and the other argument which I put together, especially in the book, is that art allows us to exit. And exit means that, you know, if you think about the old argument of democracy as the polis, as the community, which goes back to the Greek times, and as everything who is a citizen within the community has all the rights, but people who are not citizens or who don't have any rights. And then during the Greek democracy, women didn't have rights, slaves didn't have rights, and also foreigners didn't have rights because they were not citizens. So the whole idea of exiting means that what you do is you break this notion of the poling. But also there is, of the polis, or of the old idea of a political notion of inclusion. Because we talk about inclusion, but when we talk about we include, we also are excluding. And this also means that there is another idea, which probably some of you who come from the Christian tradition would remember, which you could call Pentecostal. Nothing to do with the Pentecostals as a group of people, but if you read in the Pentecost, the apostles exited into the world. So the high idea of exiting is not that you go out and become a hermit, but actually you exit into something. And this whole idea of exiting into, to me, is one of the pillars, if you like, or one of the things which we should aim at when we talk about the arts as a form of education, if you want to think about it like that. But also the arts as a form of, as a message of what it does and how the arts bring people together and how we engage with the arts as a language and all that kind of stuff. So when I think about some of these issues, here I'm talking about the very specific notion of art being taught in an art school. And I want to challenge that in a way that saying that actually what happens in an art school, especially the pedagogy, the forms of teaching and learning that happen in an art school, are very intriguing and they're very different from anything else. And some of you who are art students will probably start to recognize this. Hopefully I'm not using too many cryptic words. So we always talk about art as doing. We always talk about art as making, which is very different. But also, the first thing I'm saying is I'm suggesting that pedagogy is also a way of art's undoing. And that could be good and could be bad. Or maybe neither good nor bad, it just happens. And doing could be take it apart. It could be meaning deconstruct. Now think about art's practice here. Keep thinking about what artists do. How do works of art come across? You have Catalan here, Catalan, la rivoluzione siamo noi, we are the revolution. That actually is a parody of Joseph Beuys' image of the artist walking and suddenly he said, we are the revolution. What is the revolution? We are. It's the artists, we are. Just because we exist, we are revolutionary. That doesn't mean we will go there and burn everywhere we see in front of us. But actually, by dint of our own existence as artists, by dint of what we do, we become revolutionary. And you can think about that in totally different ways. And again, it's not political directly, but it's political implicitly. So, I mean, those are things which you need to bear in mind. The other concept or idea or axiom, if you like, which I'm putting here, is that as learning, when we engage with art as a form of learning, now whether it is a didactic form, which is, art was used in churches to teach you the story of the Bible, or if you go to a mosque, you'll find a lot of, sightings from the Holy Quran. So, I mean, or if you go to synagogues, you will find art forms in there which actually allow you to engage with the notion of the mystery of so I mean, even at a religious purpose, at a religious level, you'll find that, but also you could find it in all sorts of other ways, in secular contexts. But, so as learning, art brings nothing to itself without risk and error. And what I'm saying here is that bear in mind how we engage, how we learn, how we do art, is that when you're doing art, it's a bit like a scientist who is experimenting. You're not exactly trying to find an answer, the right answer, because there isn't one. But what you're doing is engaging and constantly in the idea of risk and the idea of error. Socrates used to try to use belief in education as a way of recollecting ideas which we had before we even were born, but also the whole idea of how in education the student, Kierkegaard wrote about Socrates saying, Socrates actually used to encourage his students to get to make mistakes. And it's through the mistake that you then realize that, okay, I'm learning through the mistakes, not by finding the right answer, but actually understanding the error and taking the risk of that, because that's not easy, it's not comfortable. It takes you out of your comfort zone. If you're comfortable when you're learning, there's a problem, at least with art. Now, art cannot teach learning as it embodies on learning. So, as I said, art itself, if you look at how an artist operates, if you look at how, and when I say an artist, I don't mean just a painter, but any artist. There are very interesting studies these days. There's a book called Artful Making, where a professor of business in the Harvard Business School actually worked with a theater director. And he looked at the way they developed their own projects in theater. And he actually wrote the book in terms of trying to understand how leadership, innovation works within that kind of context. And he found that there was a very different kind of way of going about things. Today, it's not uncommon that you find in business schools a lot of projects actually which are using artistic design thinking and all that kind of stuff, which actually develops forms of what they call innovation and leadership. But actually, in that, I would argue there's a lot of unlearning going on. I recently met a colleague of in engineering who's just got tenure, and we were talking about how we teach. And he told me I teach exactly the same way. In the lab, when he's working with engineers, he's encouraging them to not to be afraid of making mistakes, because actually if they're not making mistakes, there's something wrong, because their project is stuck. You need to kind of keep going and pushing until suddenly you realize that there's something. How do you get that kind of moment where you say, okay, this makes sense, even though it doesn't seem to make sense? And the fourth aspect here is for pedagogy to actualize art's contingency, and we'll talk about contingency. At the moment, think about contingency as a world of accidents, that nothing is really planned. I'm not criticizing the idea of, but I mean the freedom is that there are certain things which we don't really know. But also freedom means that we know our limits, we have our limitations, and we keep pushing the limit. In that contingency, okay, our pedagogy itself, the way that we teach and learn, must be continuously undone. If you like, it's in a process of continuously. And I'm going to talk a lot about what we call the iterative, which is, iterative is it continuously kind of being assessed. And again, spirit of Boyce talked about replicas. He talked about a series of, and before him, Marcel Duchamp talks about how you replicate things, and the replication of the same thing actually is in itself, although it seems to be producing the same thing all over again, the replication as a process itself gives you something different in terms of how you look at production. Whereas, as you know, Walter Benjamin, laments over the idea that art is losing its aura because of reproduction. So we are stuck between this whole idea of a replication which is continuous, which is iterative, but which through those kind of cycles there's also something going on which we learn from and we unlearn. And Nietzsche talks a lot about that. The philosopher Nietzsche talks a lot about the eternal return. It's as if we're stuck in it. But actually, eternal return doesn't mean that you are always going through the same processes. But actually, it means that in every process that you go, in every repetition, there's something different. There's something which deconstructs the one before it, maybe brings you to the attention of something new. And we'll find that also in faiths. For example, if you think about Buddhism, the whole idea of, and also reincarnation, the whole idea of how you come back, the whole idea of returning to, is a very important concept in terms of how we engage with. Now, I understand that all the theories of learning that we are very much kind of geared into, especially in terms of psychology, is that there is always this kind of progression. There's development, that we grow from being a baby to being an adult. And then we learn from our mistakes and keep going. But actually, this does not just follow that. There's also this myth of progress, that somehow we are better than the people before us, which is not exactly true. It's a bit of a kind of problematic issue. So this whole idea of progression, which we need to unlearn all these things in order to be able to kind of engage with. And one of the things that we do as human beings to do that, whether we know it or not, or we do it consciously, is to make art. Because art allows us to do that. And that's why sometimes art is so shocking. That's why, Mayor Rudolph Giuliani kicked out a bunch of artists when he thought they were being scandalous. But then actually you'll find Sister Wendy, I don't know whether you've ever seen her, and she engages with the crucifix, which was put in yellow stuff, and everyone thought it was scandalous, but actually she was saying, look at this, this is kind of an image of sacrifice, this is an image which it shocks you into knowing and engaging of what humiliation is all about. And that's what the crucifix is all about, humiliation, ultimate death. So I mean, when you engage with art, you're going to find people who have very strong feelings. And they are knocking each other off in terms of concepts. They're probably both logical or illogical, but actually you'll find that when you weigh all these different ideas, when you weigh all these different opinions, it's the relation between these opinions which is more important than the opinion itself. And when I engage with my students, I always tell them, you need to kind of keep that with me. Disagree with me. I don't want you to agree with me, because then otherwise I would be very boring, and I don't want that. So I say, no, this is all rubbish you're talking about. I'm not going to use colorful words. I'm trying to hold back. So anyway, so what is the context here? Now, if you think about the context in terms of art, but also how artists come to be, whether formally or informally, whether they go to art school or not, is that we have a concept here which is very interesting. First you have a student artist who is expected to speculate, who is expected to take a leap, even with his or her eyes closed. But then you have the artist student. And I'm not saying this is an evolution. You say these are different moments in terms of how you engage. You could be an artist, an established artist for all your life, and you still consider yourself as being a student. And there's this notion of discovery, this notion of creation, which often we overuse. Creativity these days is a buzzword. What does it mean? What do we actually mean by creativity? Sometimes I worry about it. I keep saying, okay, don't call it creative, call it something else, so that we can kind of, get off it and try to understand. But also there's this notion of making, which sometimes is very fetishistic about certain people. I have colleagues of mine who talk about art, and when they say making, it's as if they are, pronouncing a dogma of faith, which bothers me, because making could be all sorts of things. But also bear in mind that when we say poetic, it comes from the word pie in Greek, which is poiesis, which means making. But it's not just making something as a production, but it moves beyond that. There's an action within the world. There's an action on what surrounds us. And that allows us to make. The 17th century philosopher Vico, he used to argue the only way we can know the world is to make it. And that's why we don't know God. God made us, so he knows us because he made us, but we don't know him because we didn't make him. And so the assumptions that we make sometimes of eternity, of things which we don't know, is that we assume that we have made these things, but actually we haven't. And the whole idea of making is a very important thing. But then in English, there's this other word called doing. And doing is interesting because it's a form of action, but also implies not a passive object, if you like, and an active subject, but there is something else going on there. But ultimately, the artist is making, doing, he sustains learning, or the whole continuous engagement with whatever he's doing, and the engagement with knowledge, if you like, because this is what we're talking about here. The whole idea of knowledge, what is knowledge? Is it just knowing certain things, or is it a way of being, the knowable being, or the known being, by acts of unlearning and undoing? And I put undoing in the brackets. I'm not, trying to be Derrida here, but actually it's an interesting one, because doing and undoing seem to kind of be the same thing. They're part of the same thing, and they function like this. They kind of, go like this all the time. So they're not fixed. And that's an important, this is the kind of context of who are you talking about. These are the actors, if you like, of the play. So the images are not there to illustrate or to make things beautiful. Although some of them are beautiful, if you want to call them that. But they are doing something else. The whole idea of, think about Adami's work. If you don't know his work, I invite you to go and read about him. Jean-François Lyotard wrote a lot about Adami. So did Derrida. If you know those guys, if you don't know those guys, go and find them up, because they are important, especially if you're dealing with theories of art and history of art. And this is a really interesting thing. I mean, the title is a bit deceptive, but actually there are dates there, which is the birth and the death of Lenin. But on the other hand, there's something strange going on. It's in French, it's called Le Gilet de Lenin. It is the vest. And the vest is, by the way, the vest, I think it's an American there. I don't know whether it's an English, because English vest is totally different from an American vest. I think an American vest is an under vest, or is it the English one? I don't know. The English one is underneath. Yeah. So, I mean, it's the gilet, the one you wear under the jacket. But there's something ironic about that. There's something very ironic about it. There's something going on. And also the images of Adami are very interesting because they go in and out and they leave you with this thing. There's a very, very strong outline there, which is this hard sort of line. But I mean, is it suggesting something? Sometimes I find it intrusive, but it's actually everywhere in his work. And when you see these things in the flesh, I've seen a couple of them in New York actually, they are really impressive. They're huge. Some people don't like that, but actually there's something going on there. But anyway, I just put that as a backdrop if you like, but I mean there's something going on there. If you keep that ambiguity going on, with political undertones, but not really, and all that stuff, then think about pedagogy as art's undoing. Now how does that kind of, what's going on with that? So, and here I'm throwing things at you. Pick them up if you like them. If you think they're a bit too much, don't worry about them. If they're annoying, too many strange words, that's okay. Art as a gone. Now, when we talk about pedagogy or pedagogy, I don't know, whichever way you want to pronounce it, in the argo bit, we always think about it as the leading of the youth. That's what it means traditionally. But we always forget the argo bit, which is leading, but also argo is linked to a very important place in the concept of democracy. Not just old Greek democracy, but also the concept of democracy now, which is the marketplace. But the agon is also a place where there's dispute. So in the Greek concept of democracy, there was always a place, a space, and that space is important, a space, which in and of itself, people come together. If it's the market, but you come together and settle disputes. And the whole idea of a dispute is important in terms of how we engage and learn, especially at university level. In university, you're not supposed to be sitting there and I talk to you, but actually there's another aspect of this afterwards where we really engage in this, where you come and tell me this is all rubbish, I don't agree with you, I don't see it. Okay, challenge me, that's fine. So I mean, and then you challenge me, and then I might say, okay, actually you're right. So you can think of art as that kind of space. It produces that space. Now, whether it's art which is an installation art where you can really inhabit that space, or whether it's a painting, or whether it's theater where you're looking at a space and you're in a safe space there, it is a space, but it is a space of dispute which allows everything goes there. Well, no matter what people want to say that there are rules and regulations, it's not true. The only rule and regulation is that you're in there and you have to kind of, make your argument. But it's also a place for dispute, and it's also a disputed place. So if you think about it, that's a very important kind of relationship. And if you look at works of art from that angle, suddenly they start making a totally different sense. And also, I would say, aesthetically, they would start making differences. Because we keep arguing that aesthetics is a matter of beauty only, but we know that since Immanuel Kant, that has gone now. The whole idea of the aesthetic as being not necessarily true, good, and beautiful, that triad, which we still aspire to maybe as an ideal form, we know that historically the true, the good, and the beautiful are gone. There were beautiful things, or beauty was used as a matter of propaganda in order to kill millions of people. So what is beautiful is not necessarily good. But there were good things, and there are good actions, which don't look really particularly pretty, but they are good. So the whole idea of an ideal where the good, the true, and the beautiful is there has been disputed, and that has been a very important break in the whole idea of contemporary aesthetics. And that has very strong implications, especially with the onset of modernity, which, by the way, didn't just happen in the 20th century, but goes back. And also within the whole idea of what we consider now as being much more of a pluralistic kind of notion, where you don't have specific movements in the arts, but you have a lot of diversity, but also you have a lot of pluralism, and you have a lot of hybridity. So this whole idea of hybridity is, in itself, the embodiment of dispute. So if you're thinking about how do we teach this, how do we learn this in an art school, how do we engage, think about the space as a studio. The studio itself as a space, as an inert space, is pedagogical by itself because we inhabit it and we do things in there. And we are allowed to do things which you're not allowed to do in a classroom or here. You can't spill anything, by the way, because they throw us out. Whereas in a studio, probably are encouraged to start spilling paint all over the place. You might have to paint it later, but that's fine. But that also links to something which is important, is autonomy. We expect art to mediate all the time. There's been a huge dispute in philosophy of art about whether art is there to mediate between a world which is not really, which is disjointed, and art, like other forms of knowledge, bringing in some kind of conciliation. But there are also other people who say, no, if you do that, actually you're losing the autonomy by which art allows us to do things which other things don't allow us to do. So instead of seeking an answer to resolve things, art mediates itself. And this is why we're talking a lot about art's autonomy. And sometimes when people kind of try to say, but this is not allowing people to learn how to be good, artists often, they react badly to it. Because they say, it's not because artists are selfish or because they just don't want any critique, but actually because they feel frustrated because people don't really understand how art evolves in itself as an autonomous form. And when you talk about art, remember this. I mean, once an old professor told me, you're not talking about art, you're talking about people who are making art. So, I mean, we're not talking about this thing which suddenly took a life of its own, but we're talking about human beings engaging, or it's a human act, it's a human form. And to that effect, then art becomes a form of undoing, because it manifests its own autonomy by rejecting what is taught. We have been taught to do things in a certain way. And we are expected to do certain things. We are always expected to give the right answer in an exam, otherwise we'll fail. And we're expected to do this and that and the other. But when we're dealing with art, and I don't know any of you who have been involved in assessing art, I can tell you this, I've assessed art all my life in studios. And it's really kind of weird. I mean, no wonder they don't let students in. I mean, those colleagues of mine who are in this, they probably recognize it. Because actually, you have a lot of arguments between the professors as to how on earth are we coming to a kind of grade. And you could wonder, what is this mystery of how do they grade these things? I can tell you it's a bit of a mystery, because if you write it down in strict criteria, the professors would be the first who would just come up and, and say, no, we can't do that. It's not because it's alchemic, but because actually there's a continuous argument, continuous dispute. And it's through that finally we come to a conclusion that this work is worthy of an A or a B or a C. And even that is very superficial. Because actually people are looking at not only just the finished work in an educational setup, but also they're looking at all the preparation work. That's why your professors will tell you, keep your notebooks, bring in your stuff. And sometimes they ask you to go and defend your work. So I mean, that's a very important thing. But also when we are in a museum and looking at a work of art, we're all kind of engaging with it in totally different ways. So in that context, there is this kind of autonomy against which we are ranging, but actually it is an autonomy which we should partake of, participate with, because that's what gives us the autonomy that we need in order to be able to generate new knowledge, in order to be able to understand the world in different ways, in order to be able to be free. The whole idea of freedom and intelligence is not a question of do you allow me to do whatever I like, but actually it's freedom which is much more interior in terms of me understanding and being in consonance, if you like, with the world, by being dissonant with the world. So that's another aspect of it. Now, apologies for showing you my work. But anyway, you might wonder, what the hell is that to do? This is just a sketch, and I like sketching because actually it allows me to do certain things and leave them unresolved. And you know that the resolution comes after you do 50 of them. So as learning, if we think about art as learning in the context of an art school, or in the context of an art lesson with kids of all ages, art brings nothing to itself without risk and error. And this is the thing, that when we're bringing art in, I'm risking things. Just showing you my work, it's a bit like me bearing my soul to you. But it's not because it's so precious for me, but it's because I'm always in the process of not finished anything. I'm in the middle of it all the time. There's nothing which is resolved. Even the most beautiful work of art, I don't know, by Raphael or something like that, or by Picasso, which appears to be finished, you know that it's never finished. My late father, he was an artist. He trained as an artist in a very traditional way. The kind of traditional way where his teachers would tell him never use black, for example. So he was a very figurative artist. And he always told me, I can't understand Impressionism because it's almost like it's unfinished. I can't leave it like that. I have to finish it. So, and I mean, we come from, Malta is a very Catholic place. And I mean, my father was, people used to come in and say, I want a picture of the Pope, for example. So he used to paint a lot. I remember John the 23rd. I was named after him. And he used to kind of like this face of this Pope. And he used to work so much on it that it suddenly starts looking like a wax figure. And then eventually he will lose resemblance because actually, he used to admit it. I keep working on this and I never stop, and I never know when to stop because I get obsessed by it. So I mean, it is an interesting process in terms of saying, that's it, I'll stop, or accepting an unfinished thing, what appears to be unfinished to you. But actually, these are snapshots of possibilities. These are bits and pieces. These are moments, if you like. And if you think about literature, you know, reading James Joyce or reading Beckett, you know that there are these moments actually where even a small fragment of a thought is even more complete, if you like, gives you more than the whole book itself. And that's a very important thing to keep in mind, especially if you're engaging with art, whether you're historians, whether you're practitioners, whatever you are, whether you're teachers, whatever. So it is this kind of risk and this error which is important here, which is something which I'm highlighting as something which we need to kind of learn from, if you like, if you want to use the word, from art. Art allows us to do that. We do it. Art is one of our ways of doing this, of justifying this kind of unfinished business. So as I said, in the process of, if you look at a studio lesson, where someone is engaging with his professor or her professor, and they're having a conversation, or when someone is doing a crit and they are presenting to the other students. And this happens also in philosophy sometimes. And you have people actually who are kind of, you know, sometimes they try to avoid the thing because they are fixed on an idea. And that's one of the things which you need to kind of go against. You said, okay, no, open it up, keep questioning it. So, and it's where art allows you to take risks. Art is a risk in and of itself. If you're an artist, you're not just risking it because you're not going to earn much money unless you're very lucky in your career, but also in and of itself, it allows you to take risk. And there are other forms of human behavior which are very risky, you know, like sports, for example. There are certain dangerous sports. People do it. Why do they do it? But the risk itself gives you another dimension in life. This is a slightly less dangerous risk, but I mean, it is a risk. It could be dangerous if, you know, suddenly you have a mob coming against you, like, you know, Caravaggio, for example. He was known for being rejected violently by bishops and by crowds. So we know artists who have been really pelted and kind of, you know, kicked out of the city, if you like. If you think about Socrates himself, who his philosophy was very artistic because he was poetic in his work, he ended up having to kind of, he was condemned to death. And he took hemlock instead of being exiled, which is an interesting concept. So the risk is important. So art avoids the expected. If you're going to bring me the expected, normally, it's something else. It's like a scientist. If the scientist repeats, you know, reinventing the wheel. Scientist suddenly comes, I invented this thing, it's round, you know, we can do that. And say, oh, fuck, oh, that's a wheel. Yeah, okay. What have you invented? Well, but you could use the wheel in a different way. So, I mean, that would be another risk. That would reject the notion of how a wheel has been used. Suddenly start using it differently, like Duchamp did, put a bicycle wheel, stuck it on a stool, and he put it there and told you, this is a work of art. People went nuts. What? What's that? So, but also if you think about it, art, it recalls its learning. So it learns something, and the Duchamp example is a good one, but then it rejects it. So suddenly it said, okay, this is a bicycle wheel, okay, this is a bottle rack, but it's not. It's a work of art. But what do you mean by that? Why? So you reject the first learning. So you approach it and you say, okay, I can engage with this. This is not one of those artists whom I can't understand what he's doing. I can see it. It's a bicycle. It's a bit weird, but okay, it's a bicycle. It's nice to kind of, you know, joint to the... But then suddenly, well, why is it a work of art? Or he would say a found object becomes a work of art. And in these days we're not shocked, but in those days people were shocked. So suddenly a bottle rack, he signs it, it's a work of art. Not to mention the urinal, but let's mention the bottle rack. So what is that? Is it a gimmick? No, because actually what you're having is you're approaching the world in the way you learned it and recognize it, and then suddenly you reject what you've recognized and give it a different dimension, give it a totally different meaning. And that's where the issue of risk comes in, because you're risking that people don't really get it. But it's not just that, it's not popularity, it's also risking it that you are trying to engage with something which no one would respond to. So you won't have an engagement with people, and the engagement with people is very crucial in this case. But also it's the error. And you can say, no, that's not a bottle rack, or that's not a work of art, that's just a bottle rack. That's not a work of art, it's just a bicycle. So art rejects what is, and this is the thing, it's a challenge. It's a bit like, you know, trying to get out of yourself and look at yourself. Sometimes they do it in films, you know, you come out of yourself and look at yourself. And it's not like looking at yourself in the mirror, because that's a different thing. It's a reflection. It's really confronting yourself. And this is where you confront your being. So the whole idea of rejecting, but also saying this is all an error. something which we have accepted as being moral, being important, being truthful, being beautiful, suddenly you want to reject that. So by affirming what you reject, then you're seeking to identify the error. Then there's a kind of another way of moving into, breaking into new knowledge, breaking into other ways of seeing, other ways of knowing, other ways of being. And that's where suddenly we have a kind of a shift. We have an important shift. Call it a paradigm shift. That's how paradigm shifts happen in science. Same thing as they happen in the arts. Same thing. This whole idea of sciences and the arts being so different. I can tell you some of the best work that we do in this university happens when artists and scientists come together. And I'm finding that this is becoming more and more and more important and more frequent. And students, you know, we just had someone, bioengineer Peter Crisco last year, who became an artist. He said, I don't want to be a bioengineer anymore, but I mean, his bioengineering skills suddenly allowed him actually to look at structures in the biological world, amplify them, create them, recreate them, revisit them if you like, and then they become works of art and put them back into nature. And that's what he did with students. And in the botanical gardens near Monona, actually, that's what they did. And if you look at the work there, I mean, it's not there anymore, but I mean, when they showed it, it's really fascinating because it really integrated with nature, if you like, but it wasn't nature, it was manufactured. So it's that kind of thing. You could call it an error, but it's not. So, and here we have a very interesting piece by Faisal, actually, he's one of our professors here. And what I'm saying is embodying unlearning. But then, I mean, you know, so, and this is the other concept, which I'm not against learning as such. I keep talking about learning all the time, but I mean, one of the issues that we need to be very careful when we think we are learning is that learning is often taught, and is taught in a certain way. So we can only learn in a certain way, which we could call a taught learning, teach learning. Can you teach learning? You can teach someone how to learn, but to some extent that's a slightly different thing. Taught learning is more like a schooled form of learning, which is of a certain kind in a certain way. And art does not work with that. It doesn't work. If you try it, I know people who tried it, I know people who, you know, professors who try to do that, not here, but I know them in other places. And, it doesn't work. Students would just kind of, you know, they reject that. Because it doesn't work. It doesn't work because art embodies unlearning in and of itself. This is a very interesting piece to think about. I'm not thinking, I mean, I'm not, you know, I would do injustice to the work itself. But there is this reiteration, as I said, in a different way. Same thing, same image, but it's reiterated, but suddenly it becomes multiple. But this kind of multiplicity, if you like, is the multiplicity of presence, a multiplicity of stuff. There's another piece by an artist I can't remember, who actually has this video of an athlete who's going to start his race, and he stops. So the video is, it's still a video, it's not a still, it's a video, but the artist doesn't go, never leaves. There's the whole idea of never leaving, never departing, which is an intriguing thing, because you are expected to depart, you're expected to move on, but you refuse. And this kind of act of refusal, which could be iterative, it could be continuous act of refusal, is in itself a form of art, if you think about it. And when I say a form of art, it doesn't mean kind of something high or something. It is a way of expressing our own inherent aesthetic, artistic possibilities in our being. So, what is this refusal, if you like? A refusal to move, a refusal to learn, a refusal to what? It's an assertion of the possible, because in order to make something possible, it has to be impossible before, or it has to be never there. I mean, if something is already there, it's possible, but it's there. So when we talk about possibilities, we always talk about possibilities in the future, so to speak, as potentials. You know, Aristotle talks a lot about potentiality and actuality. He calls it, the word is entelekia, which basically is a realization of a potential. And we all are, as human beings, potentials. We have potentials. Everything has potentials. But I mean, these could happen, they might not happen. We might not have control on these potentials, but they're there. And I mean, who decides? Once they're possibilitated, once they become possible, then we can say, okay, that was a potential. So, let's say every one of you is a potential president. But then you would say, no, if you were not born here, then you can't be a president. Maybe they change the law, I don't know. So I mean, the potentiality in all of us is there. But on the other hand, what does that mean? Is it something which we kind of fancy? Or is it real? So how do we think about potentiality? Another concept is the imaginary, what we imagine. And Jean-Paul Sartre, he wrote a book called Imaginaire. In it, actually, it's interesting. He describes the imaginary. He said, you can't imagine a horse if it's in front of you. You have to imagine something which is not there. Otherwise, you're not imagining it, you're seeing it. So imagining it is intriguing. I mean, when you see science fiction stuff, for example, and they bring in some strange animal, normally these animals are bits and pieces of other animals that we know. Now, can you imagine something which is totally different from? And that would be really interesting. And sometimes when you come out with forms or with colors or with possibilities, there are things which people don't really recognize, and they feel like kind of, you know, almost like they're thrown off. You say, what's that? Or what's going on here? You know, imagine if when suddenly they heard Beckett, for example, the first time. What's going on? Is he joking? What is it? I mean, when they heard, I mean, when Schoenberg played his music, not many people liked it, and Stravinsky. But also when Verdi played his music, and you might think this is something which is very much accepted, actually, he was pelted with tomatoes and everything. So, I mean, the whole idea of how you break through something different, how you break out of the habits that we have, and the expected, is a very tricky one. But I mean, there wouldn't be an education worth its word, an education worth its word, if these things don't happen. Otherwise, what do you learn? Nothing. So the whole idea is that if you're taught how to learn, you're not likely to learn anything except what's being given to you. But actually, for me, the concept of learning is very much an unlearning process, whereby actually you throw out what you came in with. You come in with a set or baggage of ideas, and suddenly you throw them out, and you start looking at other things, and start engaging with others. And maybe someone will bring in an experience which you never had, and from that, then you combine it with your own experience, and suddenly something else comes in. That's what we call a dialectic. So, I mean, this is really interesting in terms of what is an art's dialectic, is very much based on this whole idea of rejection. But also it's how we embody it, because as human beings, we are rational human beings, but also we are bodies. And we are lived bodies, as Merleau-Ponty calls it, called vécu. And that's an important thing, because we live in a space. Merleau-Ponty talks about the idea of how we create a spectacle, a concept, an idea, and sets of images, and then we inhabit our own spectacle. And that's the only way we can live with ourselves, so to speak. Otherwise, if we live in a totally different situation where we don't really understand what's going on, we go bananas. So, I mean, strictly speaking, we're always doing that. We're always adjusting. It's a bit like going in these museums where you find yourself in a small room with mirrors, and suddenly you get disorientated, and you don't know where you are, partly because you're not used to those kind of spaces. The body has an ability, or the mind, or whatever, to suddenly make sense of what it is, and suddenly you kind of go stable, and you can kind of walk in it without stumbling. And those were experiments which were done by scientists and psychologists, and Merleau-Ponty, captured those ideas, which he called phenomenology. Phenomenology is the idea of being in a space, engaging with the space, amongst others, and engaging with the phenomena, the appearances that we engage with. So, I mean, there are certain things which are, we have phenomena, we see them as phenomena, we don't necessarily understand them, but we try to make sense of them. And art is entirely phenomenological, but also it is a form of embodiment. We live art with our bodies, not just with our minds. Whether you're an artist or whether you're part of the audience, you are embodying what you're seeing. If you're engaging with, suddenly you're overwhelmed by Jackson Pollock because of its size, because of what it is, because of what it does. And you are not simply engaging it as a mental process, but you're overwhelmed with it. I had when I was at Teachers College, I was really lucky at Columbia University to meet a very old professor who I ended up writing a book about her. She was called Maxine Green. And those who are interested in this whole idea of the imagination, of the whole idea of how we learn, and the aesthetic education, should go and read her work. Wonderful American philosopher. And she used to talk a lot about the whole idea of wide awakeness. That when you're engaging, she was actually a professor in residence in the Lincoln Center. Even when she was really old, she was in her 90s in a wheelchair, she would go there and fascinate everyone talking about wide awakeness. And I mean, one of the things she used to do is she would have a performer, a dancer, dancing, and then suddenly she started philosophizing and talking about this whole idea. And the whole idea of wide awakeness is this kind of encounter with the work of art. She talked a lot about that. How you're being almost overwhelmed, taken into it. It's almost like being absorbed by the work. But to do that, there are all sorts of other things. You need to unlearn what you come in with. You have to leave your baggage behind and go in and being open to it. If you're not open to it, it's not going to work. If you come in and say, oh, Jackson Pollock was just messing around with paint, fine, but you're not going to engage with it at all. So this is where it becomes intriguing in terms of how you reject what you've been taught, how you reject the taught learning, and you unlearn and move into this kind of other situation, other concept. Now this is an interesting piece where actually these artists, what they did, they put this thing and they said it would be nice to do something political. And they engaged these people of color to go and clean the windows. A lot of people just assumed that these people were immigrants, or illegal immigrants as they call it. And the assumptions they made all about these people cleaning the windows was very much in terms of what people learn about or make assumptions about other people. And when they were saying, look, let's do something political, it was very funny, because actually there's nothing political in the images there. You don't find anything very political in the images of two blonde Nordic women from Scandinavia saying it would be nice to do something political. The art was happening actually, if you like, in the engagement, or the people engaging with those hired actors who are basically cleaning the windows. And this is really intriguing, because what happens is that there are all these accidents, this is the contingency, is that pedagogy needs to actualize art's contingency. Art understands, engages with this contingent condition that we're in. We're always expecting to find everything as we want, and then we object. But actually, reality is that there's nothing which is secure, there's nothing which is certain. Because actually what we do is we have this ability of engaging with what we do in order to be able to kind of actively engage with it. And this is this activity that gives us freedom. It's not this passivity. If you're passive, expecting everything to be the same way as you expect it to be, there's no freedom there. You're basically caught up in this kind of frame of mind. The freedom comes in actively engaging with a situation which actually is showing you that you don't really know how to deal with it. And so the challenge to the expected ideas or the prejudices, if you want to call them that, might not just be a prejudice, just be an assumption. The assumption is that those are people who are immigrants. But then suddenly you say, well, hang on a minute, actually they're not, if someone tells you that. So suddenly this whole idea of what you come in with, all the certainty is gone. And that's what the art is doing. But also the expectation that a political piece of art needs to be somehow of a certain kind. This is blowing it up. It's not safe. The politics actually are in you and how you're engaging with those who are cleaning the windows. And this is where it accentuates the contingency, or art's contingency. And to do that is actually, for pedagogy, if you like, for the taught learning that we have, needs to be undone. If we don't undo what we assume to have learned and which have given us all the certainties, then art is, you become blind to art. It's not going to work for you. It just becomes an object, which either costs a lot of money, so you think it's okay because it costs a lot of money, or it becomes just a reified object, if you like, which you just see it as an object you can sell and buy and whatever. Its value becomes other than what it is. And this is not particularly a valuable work of art. It's something printed out, put in a, it could be like an advert. So I mean, suddenly the value is a very different value here. And it's challenging you in a totally different way. So, that means that art is a form of action, as I said. And action is not fabrication. Action is not simply producing things which are certain, but action is a form of freedom. So action moves beyond aesthetic production, making something nice, something beautiful. And also it recognizes life's contingency, that life is in and of itself based on uncertainty. And uncertainty is not a bad thing. Uncertainty actually is important for us to understand. It gives us responsibility, moral responsibility, it gives us social responsibility, it gives us political responsibility, because we know that there's nothing certain there, so we have to kind of engage with that. It doesn't mean you do it at the cost of everyone else, but it means that, and that's another argument, because art is a community of makers, not just one artist, and that means that you engage socially with others. And that's where action comes in. There's a philosopher, a great philosopher called Hannah Arendt, who talks about action, vita activa. There are two things which she takes from the traditions of, especially Catholic traditions. Hannah Arendt was Jewish. She talks about the contemplative life, and we know that. There is this kind of two things in life. We talk about people who are more contemplative and thinkers and whatever, and there's the active life, people who are always. But actually, vita activa and vita contemplativa are part of the same thing, and they can't be separated. But action is crucial to delivery of, it's crucial to the engagement or to the possibility of freedom. There's no action, there's no freedom. You might think you're free simply because you're accepting what there is, and you're living nicely with your kind of, but it's a form of enslavement, to be honest. Whereas action is itself allows you to question, it gives you, it expects you to reject, if you like. It doesn't make you violent, by the way. Don't think about this like that. It makes you critical if you think about it. So art is undoing, then it's in realizing the accidentality of life, if you like. Art seeks to deconstruct the limits expectation of social production. And this is where it is. You have aesthetic production and social production, which often art is expected to do, to fulfill. When a work of art is rejected sometimes by governors or by politicians or whatever, who know nothing about art, normally what happens is because they either claim that it is immoral, they either claim it's scandalous, they either claim it's creating social unrest, or they claim it's ugly. And normally in art, we always expect that. And people from, and I'm not saying, I'm talking politics here, of all kinds. People on the left, if you think about the old Soviet Union, there were artists who were thrown in jail because they were not socially producing. They were not considered to be, they were too bourgeois. They were too detached from the social society or from social endeavor. But you had also, people on the other side, if you like, in the liberal capitalistic kind of liberal democracy, where actually aesthetic production was considered to be a very important thing. Now, actually, if you think about it, both aesthetic production and social production in the history of art have deterred art from developing its own autonomy. And they were both against. So this is why you find that politicians from all traditions have something, sometimes you find them objecting to art. Or they want art to be of a form of a certain kind. Partly because they want to instrumentalize either for social means or for what they call aesthetic means. And when they talk about aesthetic production, it means privilege. It means that this is a beautiful object which I can sell, which I can make money of. So beauty itself is reduced to a very limited notion of what beauty should be. So there is no, it's an externalization of what is called beauty. And that's historically, if you look at the history of art, you would find every now and then social production and aesthetic production keep coming up in different forms. Now, to be able to kind of, put that, to offset that, is to recognize, one, the contingency that we live in. Two, but also the possibilities that come out of those contingencies, the possibilities that come out of accident. And how, by recognizing those possibilities, to use Maxine Green's, again, concept, is you release the imagination. You can only release your imagination if you're going to kind of recognize the uncertainty that is there and see in it the opportunities that it offers. So it's a very important thing, and that's what action is, and that's what freedom is. And this is why art becomes political, not because it's ideological, not because it's favoring capitalism or communism or whatever ism you want to think of, but actually it's because it rejects those isms, and it allows you to kind of, have the kind of autonomous freedom and action by which you can kind of, develop and evolve. Evolve as a humanity. And so to conclude, and this is why, Anselm Kiefer, those who don't know his work, you should go and check him out, definitely. Just as a way of ending this is not the final word by all means. So what I'm trying to say is that to fulfill art itself as art must undo its own pedagogical necessities. So the expectations that we often have, that art should be doing this and that, and especially people like us who work in art schools. And I used to be associate dean of an art and design school where all these expectations coming from everywhere. From governments, from this, from that, from the university, from whatever. But actually you have to kind of, how do you go through them? How do you navigate that? In a practical way, administratively, it's really interesting. Although it's very hard. But actually, on the other hand, you have to preserve the kind of autonomy which the students and the professors are talking about. And how do you do that? But it is definitely an important, if you like, an imperative that art must undo those kinds of pedagogical necessities, those expectations. You can close pedagogy with economic necessities, social necessities, political necessities, religious, anything that is expected from art. Those need to be undone. If they're not undone, then art becomes an instrument of something else. And that means that we as human beings who make art, and we all make art, whether we're an audience, whether we're the artists, whoever we are, we're participating, partaking of it, it means that we've lost our own agency and we lost our own freedom. Because we're not allowed to be artistic, if you like, to be aesthetic human beings, to be homo aestheticus, if someone's telling us how to do that. And that's where I want to stop. And hopefully I didn't give you a headache. Thank you so much.